Good morning. My name's JoJo. You might remember me from other Homestuck essays such as Trans Roxy and Let Jane Be Evil. I'm also working on one about Jake, comparing him to Joseph Joestar, so I thought it would be thematically appropriate to write one about Dirk to sort of finish out the Alpha Kids. This one was also heavily requested of me by a gentleman named Bucko, named Moans Annoyingly on Twitter. So go check them out. Thanks to everyone who voted on this topic on Twitter, by the way. So if you are not following me yet, I'm Funk McLovin. I almost said Funk McLovin at twitter.com. Anyway, what's Dirk's deal?
Back here again, can't get enough. JoJo explains some interesting stuff.
Dirk Strider is probably the single Homestuck character with the most diverse interpretations. People can't get a read on the guy. On top of that, there are a lot of different types of Dirks. If you watch my Vriscumentary, then you know that Homestuck characters often have splinter selves. Vriska has several, but her number pales in comparison to the amount of different Dirks there are. So in a world where Dirk himself is not only confusing, but myriad, how are we supposed to interpret this character? Sure, his various splinters have some common attributes, like his iconic Squirtle Squad shades, but who is Dirk Strider? And more importantly, what's his deal? Before we get into characterizing this motherfucker, let's identify his various splinter selves. Homestuck is a series where splinter selves are not uncommon, but Dirk has a lot of them comparatively. Let's start basic and get more esoteric. First, we have Dirk Strider, who we meet in Act 6 and follow through the events of Homestuck and later in the epilogues. This is the main Dirk, named so only because he's the Dirk that we spend the most time with, and he's the person people refer to the most when they say Dirk. Next, there's Bro. Bro has the second most legitimate claim to Dirkhood, since he is the same guy sent to a different timeline. He's genetically identical to Dirk Prime, but he grew up in different circumstances. He raised Dave in the beta timeline. Third, we have Lil Hal. This Dirk splinter is made using a copy of Dirk's brain to create an AI that resides in Dirk's shades. He begins very similar to Dirk, but he has a very different entity. He begins to diverge from Dirk Prime in some significant ways as Act 6 goes on. The next few Dirks are part of the above Dirks, or offshoots of them. There are a great many offshoots of Lil Hal, such as Arqueus Sprite, who is a sprite comprised of Equius and Lil Hal. Arqueus later becomes part of Little Cal, who becomes part of both Doc Scratch and Lord English. It's unknown how much of Lil Hal or even Dirk remains in Doc or LE, but it's safe to assume his essence is diluted somewhat. Dirk Prime also has some significant offshoots. First, there's the Dirk we see in Pester Quest, whose experience is in the offshoot timeline that the game provides. Next, there's the Candy Dirk, a version of Dirk who commits suicide because he realizes he's no longer in what Dirk considers to be the main timeline. Brain Ghost Dirk is another splinter, the idea of Dirk in Jake's mind, given actual form by Jake's hope powers. And finally, there's Ultimate Dirk, a conglomeration of every single Dirk. He is Dirk Prime, but he's also the collective of all Dirks, the ultimate self. There are also Rose and Dave, two people that Dirk is the biological and ectobiological father to. More people who contain him in some fashion, and their various splinters, such as Alpha Dave and Alpha Rose. This is a basic rundown of the many Dirk splinters. We have a lot, ranging from normal to reboot, and even ones I didn't mention, like Dave Sprite. There's even a robot, and the literal antagonist of the whole fucking comic. There are only a few times where Dirk addresses this conundrum, but it's safe to assume it weighs pretty heavily on them. I'll have links to the story pages down below, but once it's where he's talking to Dave, and another time during a discussion with Lil Hal. Dirk's story is mired in splinterhood. He is a character who is undergoing a complex identity crisis. Most people who undergo these sort of crises are conflicted because of a lack of self-reflection, but Dirk suffers precisely because of this self-reflection. He sees his own traits reflected back at him in a funhouse mirror that is his own selves, be it a corrupted guardian of Dave or a robot version of his brain. This, basically, is Dirk's deal. Identity crisis. In the epilogues, Dirk attempts to remedy this by pursuing his ultimate self, a self who is a conglomeration of all his selves. It's unclear exactly what specifically this constitutes, but it's also clear based on the epilogues that this doesn't really help Dirk's journey. Essentially, he becomes the antagonist due to this clarity. He makes grand, sweeping decisions that affect people's lives, but his decisions ring somewhat hollow. For instance, he says to Jake that he will never break his heart again, but in reality, Dirk chooses to leave, to run away from the people he loved, and it's strongly hinted that Dirk still thinks about Jake and the life that he left behind. An issue Dirk faces is self-honesty and manipulation. Not manipulation in the conventional sense, not quite the direction of manipulation that Terezi and Vriska undertake. Dirk's manipulation is not necessarily subterfuge, but direct control. He desires control over his friends for their own benefit, even early on. In the Flash Synchronize, Dirk and Lil Hal work together to get everyone in the game, using his knowledge and puppet mastery. It's an intricate dance, all Dirk shouldering the responsibility for getting his friends into the game. Later in the epilogues, to keep the narrative going, Dirk manipulates his friends again, setting the stage for Homestuck 2. Dirk has control, but he doesn't view it like the other characters do. To him, it is a burden. It is his own martyrdom. Dirk's need for control circles around back to his identity crisis. He feels in control of the external world, but the internal world, to him, is on fire. He's disciplined and adept at manipulating situations and his own friends, but his own feelings get the better of him. Unlike Dave, who keeps his feelings under wrapped out of introversion and social nerves, Dirk keeps his feelings in check to further his own self-discipline. He stifles himself many times, telling Jane that he could never tell Roxy he thinks she's strong. In a way, this plays almost selfishly. People seek his approval and friendship, and he pushes them away to keep them out in one way or the other. He wants to be the arbiter of all of their lives. His relationship with Jake, for instance. He knows that Jane has feelings for Jake, but he acts upon his feelings anyway, burning the bridge between them in some form or another. Then, immediately, he pushes Jake away with his superficial clinginess until Jake is too dejected to want anyone at all. For so long, he's prided himself on being self-sufficient and in control that he doesn't understand how to interface with people in an earnest way. He remains a repressed husk, even after working out his feelings in Act 6 with Dave and Lil Hal. Notably, he's also the only one to ignore the effects of trickster mode. His mind is something of a steel trap, and this reinforces the way he sometimes seems like the odd one out, the one corralling his friends rather than playing with them. There are many times he uses self-sacrifice for his friends, like the time he decapitated himself in order to get into the game, or held off Caliborn, or when he was decapitated again in the fight with the Jacks during Collide. This self-sacrifice is, in a way, routine, almost, because in each case he's swiftly brought back, giving his sacrifices a somewhat warped significance. Interestingly, his E-Zodiac sign is, according to his lunar sway and aspect and birthday, Saggio, known as the ego, reflecting his lonerism and emphasis on the self, or in this case, selves. The readers of Homestuck 2 were unhappy when Dirk did the things that he chose to do in the epilogues. They were dismayed to see Dirk become the villain, but Homestuck 2 is far from over. We don't know yet what Dirk will do, and we don't know his goals, other than beginning other Spurb sessions with Rose. He now has ultimate control, the control of the narrative. This continues his arc very intelligently into a new property, and creates an interesting new villain. I think I speak for a great many people when I say that I wish Dirk's issues could have been worked out in Homestuck 2, but it's hard to argue that this move isn't in his character. Dirk is not necessarily an egoist, but he does value his own control, a control which is only natural to see being flexed in the narrative that the Homestuck writers chose to take. So this answers the question, what's Dirk's deal? He's a repressed fellow with a desire to control. He's not manipulative, he's not desperate, and even in Homestuck 2, he isn't evil. It's more that he's misguided in which ways to use his talents and afraid of being close to those around him. Distance, control, observation. Like a machine, raised by two machines, alone, His only worldly companion is an AI machine and a crude reflection of himself. His friends a world away, warped and abused by the loneliness he experienced. That is Dirk's deal. I hope that was a satisfying dive into Dirk's character, and I hope everyone listening enjoyed it. If you like my Homestuck essays, in the description there's going to be a link to a playlist with some of my other essays, most of them linked to Homestuck. So go ahead and do that. Give me a sub if you haven't already. I'll have more of these out pretty soon in the future. And check out my Song a Day project, where I post one song every day for the year of 2020 to kick off the new decade. I hope everyone has a great day, and I guess I'll sign off with my old classic trans rights. Everyone have a good one.